He had nothing to offer her world. She had everything, except a reason to stay in it. One rainy night, a man with empty pockets and a daughter at home made a choice that a boardroom full of executives never could. Nobody saw it coming. Not her investors, not her board, not even him. What started as a stranger holding an umbrella over a woman being ambushed by cameras became the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done. Trust someone. If you've ever believed in a person when the whole world said don't, stay until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it all started, Logan Hayes was running late. Not catastrophically late, not the kind of late that ends careers or breaks relationships, but the grinding, humiliating kind of late that belongs exclusively to parents. The sort where you've recalculated your route 3 times, skipped dinner, and you're still going to disappoint somebody. He had 17 minutes to pick up Mia from Clara's apartment across the neighborhood before Clara's overnight shift at the hospital started, and the rain had turned Creston Avenue into a river of red brake lights. He pulled his jacket tighter and stepped out of the car. The parking structure on Halford was 2 blocks from Clara's building, and if he ran, he'd make it. Logan was used to running. He locked the car, shoved his keys into his pocket, and moved. He'd covered maybe half a block when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure shift in the crowd moving along the sidewalk. A ripple. People were slowing and clustering around something near the entrance of the Alderton Hotel. The kind of clustering that always meant either an accident or a scene, and in this city, it was usually the second one. Logan's instinct was to go around it. He didn't have time. But then he saw the woman. She was standing at the top of the hotel's front steps, and the men closing in around her weren't hotel staff. They were photographers. 4 of them, maybe 5, moving in that particular sideways crab walk that photographers use when they want the shot but don't want to be called aggressive. Cameras raised, flashes strobing through the rain, and the woman had one hand up in front of her face and the other pressed flat against the wall behind her, and she was completely, utterly cornered. Logan didn't think about it. He moved through the edge of the crowd, stepped directly in front of the nearest photographer and said, "Hey, back up." The photographer, a thick guy with a media lanyard and a Canon the size of a small dog, lowered his lens maybe an inch. "Public sidewalk, pal. Step off. She's asking you to stop." "I don't hear her asking anything." Logan looked at the woman. She dropped her hand slightly, and he could see her face now, pale, jaw tight, eyes that were working very hard at projecting control over what was clearly the opposite of control. She was beautiful in a severe way, cheekbones like something carved, dark hair plastered against her neck by the rain. She was also shaking slightly, and she probably didn't know it. Her eyes met his. She said nothing. "She doesn't have to say anything," Logan said, turning back to the photographer. "Look at her." "I am looking at her. That's the whole point. I'm not her handler." Logan pulled his jacket off and held it up between the cameras and the woman, blocking the angle. It was a stupid low-tech solution, a $30 windbreaker creating dead space in the shot line. "But I'm standing here until you move back." There was a long moment. The rain came down harder. A second photographer tried to circle around his left. Logan stepped sideways. He kept his voice flat and uninterested, the voice he used when Mia was testing him, and he needed her to understand he was serious without making it a fight. "You can keep trying, or you can just leave. I've got nowhere to be." It was a lie. He had 16 minutes, now 15. But the photographers read something in him. Maybe the total absence of theatrics, the fact that he wasn't angry or performing. He was just an obstacle. And after another beat of clicking shutters, they started to pull back. One threw a comment over his shoulder, something cutting and low that Logan didn't catch over the rain. Then they were gone, bleeding back into the lobby crowd like they'd never existed. Logan lowered his jacket. The woman was watching him. The shaking had stopped, or she'd locked it down, and what was left was something more guarded, a careful, calculating assessment. He had the distinct impression she was deciding whether to be grateful or suspicious, and that the math was closer than he'd have liked. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." Her voice was steady. The word fine was packed with enough weight to sink a boat, but her delivery was flawless. He guessed she'd said it 10,000 times. "You don't have to eat," he started. I said, I'm fine. A pause. Then, fractionally softer. Thank you. Logan looked at his watch. 14 minutes. Sure. He started to walk. He heard her voice follow him. You're not going to ask who I am? He glanced back. No. She looked almost thrown by that. Not hurt, but genuinely surprised, like a chess player who'd expected a move and received something off the board entirely. He didn't wait to see what her expression settled into. He turned back toward the street and ran. He made it to Clara's with 90 seconds to spare. Mia was at the door before he knocked, the way she always was, as if she had a radar for him. She was 10 years old and looked exactly like her mother. Dark brown eyes that went a little sideways when she was skeptical, a gap between her front teeth she'd have for maybe another year before the adult teeth finished coming in. She was wearing her backpack already and holding her jacket. You almost didn't make it, she said. I made it. Your hair is soaking. It's raining. She gave him the look, the one she'd inherited from his wife Sarah, whole and complete, as if it were genetic property passed down through chromosomes. The look that said, I see through every word you're saying with total efficiency and no malice. Logan had loved that look when it belonged to Sarah. With Mia, it did something to his chest he didn't have language for. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. Come on. Clara appeared in the hallway behind Mia, mid-40s, already in her scrubs, coffee in hand. She worked nights 3 times a week at Elmwood General and watched Mia on the evenings Logan's schedule ran long, which was more often than he'd like and less often than it had once been, which was progress. How's the project? Clara asked. Still standing. You got the building? Not yet. Monday meeting. She shook her head, but it wasn't skepticism. Clara had known Logan long enough to understand that not yet from him was different from not yet from most people. It meant moving. He herded Mia out into the rain, holding his jacket over her head while she complained that she had her own jacket. And he said yes, but yours doesn't have a hood. And she said yes, it does. And he realized she was right. She put her hood up and walked beside him in pointed, dignified silence. Their car was the kind of car that requires you to know its specific personality. Which side you need to open first. How long the heat takes. The low-grade wine the vents make for the first 3 minutes. Mia knew it as well as Logan did. She buckled herself in, pulled out the battered library book she'd been working through for 2 weeks, and opened it without looking at him. Good day? He asked. Good enough, she said. We did fractions. I hate fractions. Fractions are important. So is sleep. Nobody cares. He laughed, short and genuine, and she tried not to smile. He saw it anyway. The drive home took 20 minutes in the rain. Logan knew every light on this stretch of road, every pothole on Greer, and the dip on Semmes that filled up in bad weather. He'd driven this route for 4 years. He knew it the way he knew all the surviving architecture of his life. By necessity, by repetition, by the fact that some things you stop seeing when you can no longer afford the luxury of stopping. He thought about the woman on the hotel steps for approximately 45 seconds, then let it go. He had bigger things. The community center didn't have a name yet. It occupied the ground floor of a building on Delmore Street that used to be a dry cleaner and, before that, a hardware store. And before that, if the older neighbors were to be believed, a bar with a back room where very little that was legal had occurred. The building had been sitting empty for 3 years when Logan started talking to the owner, an elderly man named Purcell, who lived 2 states away and had inherited the property from a brother he hadn't spoken to in a decade. It had taken 6 months of phone calls to get Purcell to a conversation about terms, and those terms were still being negotiated, and the Monday meeting Logan had referenced to Clara was with a neighborhood grant coordinator who had access to a small pool of city development funds. Small was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but the space existed, and the people existed, and the need was not something Logan had manufactured to fill a gap in his calendar. He saw it in the parents he encountered at Mia's school, the ones who dropped kids off at 7:30 with the look of people already bracing for impact, who couldn't afford aftercare, who were navigating child support disputes and benefit paperwork and second jobs while trying to be present enough for their kids to feel like they had a parent rather than a hazard warning. Logan had been one of those parents. He understood it with the specific clarity of someone who'd lived it, and that specificity was the whole point. He wasn't doing this to feel useful. He was doing it because the scaffolding he'd needed hadn't been there, and he'd watched other people fall through floors that shouldn't have given. The project had no official name. Internally, Logan called it the Center, which was not a name but a placeholder that had somehow hardened into habit. He had 3 volunteers: Dom, who was 26 and had grown up 2 blocks from Delmore and had opinions about the neighborhood's history that were sharp and often correct; a woman named Priya, who had a background in social work and had heard about Logan's effort through a mutual contact and shown up one Saturday with paint supplies and said, "Tell me what you need." And Richie, who was 61 and semi-retired and had 7 grandchildren and treated the whole enterprise with a combination of skepticism and absolute loyalty that Logan found useful. They'd spent 4 months cleaning the space, running extension cords, setting up folding tables, hanging a donated whiteboard, holding informal workshops on weekend mornings, navigating child benefits, resume help, connecting people with legal aid contacts. Nothing formal. Nothing funded. Just a folding table and the particular electricity that gets generated when people who are struggling find out they're not struggling alone. The Monday meeting went okay. Okay meaning the grant coordinator, a young woman named Serena Chen, was genuinely interested, had actually read Logan's proposal, and was not telling him no. She was telling him the timeline was compressed and the city's development fund had 7 other applicants, and the building security question needed to be resolved before any money could be attached to the space. Logan thanked her and drove to Delmore and stood in the center of the empty main room and looked at the water damage on the far wall that they hadn't been able to fully address and did the math again. He needed the building on contract, which required capital he didn't have, before the city grant money could be mobilized. It was the particular catch-22 of community development. You couldn't get investment without stability, and you couldn't get stability without investment. He'd been here before, in different forms. He knew the shape of the problem. He didn't know the solution, which was separate. He sat down on a folding chair in the middle of the empty room and ate the sandwich he'd packed that morning, and looked at the water damage and thought. He didn't think about the woman again until he saw her face on a screen. It was Tuesday evening, maybe 4 days after the hotel steps, and he was picking Mia up from school, and there was a television in the front office running a cable news loop, and there she was, the woman from the rain, only composed and precise, in a charcoal blazer, standing at a podium in front of a room of people in suits. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, AVA Sterling, CEO, Sterling Meridian Group, Annual Investor Briefing. Logan stopped walking. On screen, Ava Sterling was speaking without notes, and the room was paying the kind of attention that is involuntary. Not polite, not engaged, but locked in. She moved through her remarks with what Logan recognized as practiced fluency, the kind of composure that is built rather than born. She was good at this. The camera did the usual thing cameras do with beautiful people in positions of power, but Logan found himself watching her hands, still, very still, folded at the podium edge, the only part of her body that seemed to be working to stay where it was. He remembered her in the rain, the shaking she didn't know she was doing. Dad, Mia was standing beside him. We can go now. Right, he said. He turned off the screen in his head and went back to the business of being present. Isha. Ava Sterling's week had been 3 weeks long. She knew this logically, could look at her calendar and account for the hours, but the time felt compressed and stretched simultaneously in the way it always did when her professional life was holding multiple, simultaneous emergencies and requiring her to be fully present in all of them. The photographers at the Alderton had been a problem she'd seen coming. The merger with Harmon Capital was the largest deal Sterling Meridian had pursued in its history, and Ava had learned through experience that large deals created information vacuums, and information vacuums were filled by speculation. And speculation in the financial press tended to center on the most personally damaging angle available. The question being circulated in certain circles was whether she was managing the company or being managed by her board, which was a version of the question that had followed her for 3 years, the one that dressed itself in different clothes but was always the same underneath. Is she really in charge, or are we waiting for her to fail? She was 30 years old. She had taken a company her father had built into functional crisis and turned it into something that generated quarterly returns that made her competitors nervous. She had done this through a combination of instinct, 70-hour weeks, and the kind of ruthless prioritization that required her to make peace with being unliked. She had made that peace. She was fine with it. She was not fine with the photographs. Not because they were damaging. They were manageable. She was managing them. But because of the moment they'd captured, not the image itself, which showed a woman shielding her face, which was not ideal but not catastrophic. What bothered her was the truth behind the image. The 3 seconds before the cameras closed in when she had felt genuinely, viscerally cornered, and the terror of that sensation had been out of all proportion to the actual threat. She was a CEO being photographed. She was not in danger. She had no rational reason to feel the way she'd felt. She had felt that way anyway. She didn't talk about things like that. There was nobody to talk to, which was a statement of fact rather than self-pity. Her executive team was competent and loyal and professionally bounded. Her assistant, Nadia, was exceptional and knew more about Ava's daily life than anyone alive. And their relationship was warm in the functional way of people who spend 8 hours a day managing logistics together. Her college friendships had thinned with distance and the particular social gravity of different life trajectories. Her mother called on Sundays. Her father had stopped calling 3 years ago when Ava had refused to let him appoint his friends to her board. She had the life she'd built. It was impressive. It was also, in the particular quiet of her penthouse apartment on Thursday nights, not quite enough, in a way she hadn't figured out how to address and rarely allowed herself to examine. The man from the hotel steps was an inconvenience she was still processing. Not because anything had happened, nothing had happened, he'd blocked a camera and walked away, but because of the specifics of it. He hadn't known who she was. She was certain of that, had been watching his face, and there had been nothing there that indicated recognition. He'd looked at the situation and responded to it as a situation, not as an opportunity. He hadn't handed her a card. He hadn't asked for anything. He'd said, "You okay?" Heard her lie, and left. She had a researcher on her team whose entire job was to process incoming corporate intelligence. On Wednesday morning, she found herself, and this was the part she was less comfortable examining, running a search herself. It didn't take long. The search pulled up a small local news story from 2 months prior, a feature in the Creston neighborhood newsletter that had made it onto a community development blog. A photo of a man in a gray t-shirt standing in front of a partially painted wall, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be doing something else than being photographed. Logan Hayes, founder of the as-yet unnamed Delmore Street Community Project, on what it means to build something from nothing. She read the piece. Twice. It was not a sophisticated piece of journalism. It was a profile by someone who liked him, and it showed. The language was warm, and the framing was generous, and the photo was slightly out of focus. But there was something in the substance that she couldn't dismiss. He was a single father who had lost his wife 4 years prior and had used the experience of navigating that grief alongside the specific practical chaos of solo parenthood to understand a gap in his community's infrastructure. He wasn't running a nonprofit. He wasn't raising venture capital. He was cleaning a building on a street nobody was paying attention to and running Saturday morning workshops on a folding table. Ava sat back and looked at her ceiling for a long moment. Then she called Nadia and asked her to clear Thursday afternoon. She almost didn't go. 3 times between leaving the office and arriving at Delmore Street, she nearly reversed course. This wasn't her domain. She had a foundation arm for community investment. She had team members whose entire role was to evaluate exactly this kind of grassroots project, and the correct move was to have one of them reach out through appropriate channels. But she found herself thinking about the look on his face when he'd walked away from her in the rain. Not triumphant, not pleased with himself, and just done. Already moving to the next thing, like what he'd done hadn't been exceptional to him, just the obvious response. She couldn't remember the last time she'd met someone who operated like that. She parked 2 streets over and walked. The building was exactly what the photograph had suggested. Functional, partially repaired, radiating the specific energy of a place that isn't finished but is alive. The door was open. Inside, she could hear 2 voices talking, a man and a woman, arguing mildly about paint colors and structural priorities. Ava walked in. The man was Logan Hayes, She would have recognized him anyway, from the photo, but she recognized him specifically from the way he moved, economical and unhurried, nothing wasted. He was looking at something on the far wall with a woman in her 40s who had paint on her sleeve and an expression that suggested this paint color argument was not new. Neither of them heard her come in. Ava stood in the center of the room, took in the folding tables, the whiteboard, the patched drywall, the extension cords running along the baseboards, the poster on the wall that someone had hand-lettered with workshop schedule dates. She stood there for maybe 30 seconds before Logan turned and saw her. He looked at her with the exact same face he'd had at the hotel, calm, assessing. No performance. "You're the woman from the steps," he said. "You didn't Google me," she said. "I did, eventually." He said it without apology. "After I saw you on the news. And you didn't reach out. Why would I?" Priya had stopped arguing about paint and was watching this exchange with the look of someone who has walked into a conversation mid-sentence and is still calibrating. Ava looked around the room again. "This is impressive." "It's not finished." "I know, that's why it's impressive." A beat. He waited. "I want to invest," Ava said. "Not through a foundation arm, not a press release donation. Actually work with you. Fund the building acquisition, expand the program, do it right." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the rain resuming outside. Logan looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not grateful or flattered. If anything, it was cooler. "No," he said. Priya made a small sound. "You haven't heard the proposal," Ava said. "I don't need to." He turned back to the wall, not dismissively, but with the finality of someone who has made his calculation. "You're a CEO. Sterling Meridian is in the middle of a major merger. That means you need good press and you need it from a source that looks authentic. This," he gestured at the room, "is exactly what that looks like." Ava felt the back of her neck go very still. "That's not why I'm here. Maybe, but I'm not interested in being someone's charity optics while they negotiate a billion-dollar deal." He turned to look at her again, and his eyes were direct, not unkind, just honest. "I've seen how this works. Money comes in, conditions come with it. People start managing what we do to protect the investment narrative. And the people this is actually for become props in somebody's CSR report." The room stayed quiet. Ava's jaw was tight. She could feel it. She said very evenly, "You don't know what I'm offering." "Tell me one thing," he said. "One condition that comes with the money." "No conditions." "There are always conditions." "Not with this." He looked at her. "I'm serious," Ava said, and she meant it, which was the part she hadn't quite anticipated, that being challenged this directly, this early, had stripped away the professional scaffolding and left something more honest in its place. "I have no conditions. I want to see this work. That's it." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Come back Monday," he said. "We have a grant meeting in the morning. You can sit in the corner and observe. Don't speak unless I ask you something, and if Richie doesn't like you, you leave." "Who's Richie?" "You'll know." Richie was a 61-year-old man with forearms like industrial cable and a built-in detector for people who were wasting his time. He arrived at the Monday meeting 7 minutes early, sat down at the folding table, poured himself coffee from a thermos he'd brought himself, and looked at Ava Sterling across the table with the specific expression of a man who has been burned before and remembers the temperature. Ava sat in the corner as instructed. Richie looked at Logan. "Why is she here?" "She's observing," Logan said. "Why?" "She wants to help." "Yeah," Richie said, and picked up his coffee. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Serena Chen from the city's development office walked through the updated grant timeline, the building contract requirements, the compliance documentation they still needed. Logan asked questions that were precise and functional. Priya had a spreadsheet. Dom had objections to 3 of the city's conditions that were not unfair objections. Richie said almost nothing, but twice caught an error in Serena's timeline framing that nobody else had caught, and corrected it without fanfare. Ava sat in the corner with her hands folded on her knees and did not speak. At one point, a question came up about the building's fire egress certification, a technical issue involving the stairwell access documentation that Serena didn't have the answer to. Ava knew the answer. She dealt with this exact certification question on a commercial property development Sterling Meridian had funded 2 years prior. She knew the specific form number, the city office that handled it, the typical turnaround time. She said nothing. When the meeting ended and Serena packed up and left, Richie stood and looked at Ava. "You knew the answer to the fire egress thing," he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Logan told me not to speak unless he asked." A pause. Richie said, and went to refill his coffee. Logan, from across the room, was looking at her. She met his eyes and he gave the very slight, almost invisible shift of expression that she was already learning to read. The thing that sat just below a nod. Acknowledgement. Nothing more, but nothing less. She came back the following week, and the week after. It wasn't a regular arrangement, not formally. Ava didn't announce herself or schedule her visits. She showed up in windows between meetings, sometimes in full office clothes that were absurd, in a building with construction dust on the baseboards, sometimes having changed out of them, which was its own kind of statement. She helped with things that needed help, a spreadsheet that had been driving Dom to distraction, a contact at the city planning office who owed her a phone call, a question about legal structure that she answered precisely and then got out of the way. Logan watched this with careful attention. He was not warming to her. That would be the wrong way to describe it. He was revising. Logan had encountered enough people in suits bearing generosity to be professionally skeptical of all of them, and that skepticism was not irrational. It was the product of watching what happened when institutional money touched grassroots effort, the slow drift of priorities, the mission creep, the moment the community started serving the donor's narrative instead of the other way around. He had built this particular armor plate by plate, and he was not going to set it down because a woman with good eye contact showed up 3 Mondays in a row. But he was watching her. He noticed that she never mentioned Sterling Meridian when she was in the building. He noticed that she listened when Dom talked about the neighborhood's history with the particular quality of attention that means something is actually landing, not just being cataloged. He noticed that she ate the terrible coffee without complaining, twice, which was not nothing. He noticed the way she was with Mia. Mia had started appearing at the center on Saturdays when Logan needed to be there and couldn't arrange other care. She was not a child who warmed to strangers. She had her mother's instincts, precise and unsentimental. And she had greeted Ava with the kind of formal, measuring politeness that would have been familiar to any teacher who'd ever tried to win her over. The first Saturday, Mia had sat in the corner with her library book and watched Ava help reorganize the supply shelf with clinical disinterest. The second Saturday, she had asked Ava, without preamble, why she wore heels to a construction project. Ava had looked down at her shoes, block heels, sensible by her standard, ridiculous in context, and said, "Good question. I don't know." Mia had looked at her for a beat. "You could just wear sneakers." "I could," Ava agreed. "Do you own sneakers?" A pause. "I genuinely don't know." Mia had returned to her book. But the following Saturday, Ava had arrived in sneakers, plain, clearly purchased recently, wrong kind for the weather. And Mia had noticed without saying anything, just looked at the shoes and then back at her book with the very slight private satisfaction of a person who has been proven right about something. Logan had seen this. He hadn't said a word. Well, it was Priya who showed him the first photograph. A Tuesday morning, 3rd week of November. And Priya was standing in the doorway of the center with her phone held up, and an expression that was caught between apologetic and something more complicated. The photo was on a financial news site. Logan and Ava standing outside the building on Delmore. He remembered the conversation. It had been nothing. They'd been talking about the egress documentation. But from the angle of the shot, they looked like something. Not colleagues. Something else. The caption read, Sterling Meridian CEO Ava. Sterling, photographed at an undisclosed location with unidentified companion. Questions continue regarding her focus ahead of Harmon Capital merger. Logan looked at it for a long moment. "How long has there been a photographer on this block?" he said. "I don't know," Priya said. "I'm sorry." "Why are you apologizing?" "I don't know," she said again, and she looked genuinely troubled. Logan handed the phone back. He looked at the wall, the far wall with the water damage, mostly repaired now, painted over, not perfect but standing. He thought about what came next, methodically, the way he approached problems. And he thought about Ava, who was walking into a situation she had probably predicted and had shown up anyway, and he was not sure yet what to make of that. He called her. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was the voice she used when she was working, steady and contained, and he could hear behind it the faint texture of someone who had already been dealing with this for 3 hours. "You saw it," she said. "Yes." "I want you to know this doesn't change anything from my side." "I know," he said. A pause on the line. Something shifted in it. "Logan," the professional voice had gone somewhere else. "I'm sorry this caught you." "It's fine," he said, and meant something different than she'd meant it in the rain when she'd used the same word to mean the opposite. He meant, "I've handled worse. I'm not worried about me. I'm thinking about you." He didn't say that. He wasn't ready to say that. "Come on Wednesday," he said. "The grant documentation is almost complete, and I want a second set of eyes on the language." Another pause. Then, "Okay." He hung up. Stood in the center of the room, in the building that was not yet theirs, with the winter pressing in against the walls. He thought about the hotel steps, the shaking she didn't know she was doing, the complete practiced calm with which she'd said fine and meant nothing of the sort. And he thought about Mia, sitting in the corner with her library book, watching someone quietly decide to come back, again and again. Not for the cameras, not for the story, just for this. He looked at the repaired wall for a long time. Then he got back to work. The photograph ran for 3 days before it stopped being useful to anyone, which was about 2 days longer than Logan had expected and 1 day longer than Ava had predicted. By Friday, it had been replaced in the financial news cycle by a quarterly earnings report from a competitor, and the question of what Sterling Meridian's CEO was doing on a side street in the Creston district faded back into the ambient noise of market speculation. But the board had noticed. Ava knew this the way she knew most things about her board, not because anyone said it directly, but because of what stopped being said. The weekly check-in with her CFO, Gerald Marsh, had a new texture to it, a particular careful neutrality in the way he moved through the agenda items, skipping over anything adjacent to the merger timeline without quite looking at her. Gerald was 63 years old and had been in finance long enough to have developed a professional language made almost entirely of omissions. Ava had learned to read him the way you read weather, not from what was visible, but from the quality of the pressure change before the front moved in. She said nothing about it. She went back to Delmore on Wednesday, as she'd said she would. The grant documentation was spread across 3 folding tables, and Logan had color-coded sections with sticky notes in a system that made complete sense once he explained it, and 0 sense before that. They sat across from each other in folding chairs and worked through the language for 2 hours. And Ava caught 2 places where the liability framing was ambiguous enough to cause problems, and 1 place where the city's own template language contradicted their stated requirements, which she flagged without satisfaction. "How do you know this stuff?" Logan asked, looking at the section she'd marked. "I've read a lot of bad contracts." "That's not an answer." "It's the honest one." She capped the pen she'd been using. "When I took over Meridian, there were 11 active agreements with terms that had been drafted by people who were either careless or counting on the other party not to read carefully. 3 of them had cost the company money it didn't have. So I read everything after that. Every line." Logan was quiet for a moment. "How old were you when you took over?" 27. He looked at her, not with the skepticism he'd worn in the early weeks, but with something more considered. "And your board let you?" "My board didn't have a choice. My father owned controlling interest. He handed it to me." She said it without drama, which was how she'd learned to discuss it. The flattest possible delivery drained most of the productive energy out of the topic. "It wasn't a gift. It was a test he assumed I would fail." Logan set down his own pen. "Did he tell you that?" "He didn't have to." The building was quiet except for the low sound of traffic on Delmore and the heat cycling through the baseboards. One of Dom's repair projects that was functional but not silent. Logan looked at the documentation in front of him and then back at her, and she had the particular feeling of being read in a way she wasn't accustomed to, not assessed for usefulness or threat level, just looked at directly. Does he know he was wrong? Logan asked. I don't know what he knows, Ava said. We don't talk. Another quiet beat. Logan picked his pen back up and returned to the document, and Ava did the same, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something in the room had shifted in a way that was easier to feel than to name. The faint recalibration of two people who have exchanged a real thing and are still deciding what to do with it. They finished the documentation at 7:30. Dom arrived near the end to drop off some materials and stayed long enough to eat the pizza Logan had ordered, standing over the folding table with the specific comfortable rudeness of a man who was entirely at home in a space and had no performance to maintain. He talked about a meeting he'd had with a neighborhood resident association, an ongoing tension between longtime residents and a developer who'd been making noises about the block adjacent to Delmore. He talked about it with anger and precision and occasional profanity, and Logan listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was logging every detail. Ava listened too. You know Carlisle Development? Dom said at one point, not looking at her, still working through his third slice. I know the principals, she said. And? They're not people who respond to persuasion. Dom looked at her then. What do they respond to? Better offers, competing interests? The specific math of when staying is more expensive than leaving. She paused. That's not advice. I don't know the situation. Dom looked at Logan. Logan gave him the slight lift of the chin that meant noted. You're different than I thought you'd be, Dom told Ava, and went back to his pizza. Ava didn't say anything to that, but walking to her car 2 blocks over in the cold November dark, she caught herself doing something she hadn't done in a long time, replaying a conversation for what it had actually meant, not for what it implied strategically. Just turning it over, like it had weight worth holding. She got in the car and sat there for a moment before starting it. The loneliness of her apartment was going to be sharper tonight, she knew. That was the specific tax of an evening like this one. The reminder, arriving with the warmth of it, that warmth was something she'd been going without. She started the car and drove. The third week of December brought the kind of cold that settled permanently into buildings that weren't properly insulated, and the Delmore Center had exactly the heating infrastructure you'd expect from a building that had been vacant for 3 years. Logan had found 2 space heaters at a salvage sale and positioned them strategically, which solved the problem for roughly 40% of the room. The Saturday morning workshops had picked up in attendance, 8 families in the last session, which was the most they'd had yet, and 3 of them had found each other in ways that produced the specific knock-on effect Logan had always believed was the real point. Not the resource, but the network. People finding out they weren't alone in it. Mia had started treating the center like a second home, which Logan had mixed feelings about for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. She was 10. She should be in environments where 10-year-olds existed in quantity. She should have weekends involving other children and the kind of low-stakes chaos that childhood is supposed to provide. The fact that she was comfortable at the center, that she'd taken it on as part of her landscape, was both practical and a reminder that Logan's choices had perimeter effects on her life that he tracked obsessively, and not always accurately. But she liked it there. She liked Dom, who talked to her with the complete absence of condescension that children recognize instantly and respond to with absolute loyalty. She liked Priya, who brought good snacks and once spent 45 minutes helping Mia with a school project on local ecosystems, with a focus that suggested she'd entirely forgotten the adult work she was supposed to be doing. And she had arrived at a kind of careful, watching acceptance of Ava that Logan monitored the way he monitored everything about Mia's emotional world, with full attention and a light touch. On the second Saturday in December, Mia asked Ava to help her with fractions. Logan was on the other side of the room, reviewing supplier contacts with Richie. When it happened, he saw Mia slide her workbook across the table toward Ava without preamble, which was Mia's version of a significant gesture. Ava looked at it, then at Mia, and moved her chair to sit beside her. He turned back to Richie and the suppliers. 20 minutes later, he heard Mia laugh, short and surprised, the way she laughed when something genuinely caught her off guard. He did not look over. He looked at the spreadsheet in front of him and listened to Richie talk about a materials vendor discount, and kept his face exactly as it was. Richie, who missed nothing, said without looking up, "She's good with the kid." "Mia's good with most people who treat her like a person," Logan said. "That's more selective than it sounds." "I know." Richie was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She comes back every week, and she never once made it about her." I noticed. Just saying. Richie clicked through to the next page of the spreadsheet. I was wrong about her, and when I'm wrong about people, I like to acknowledge it internally and then immediately act like I knew all along. Logan looked at him. "It's a system," Richie said. "It works for me." Logan laughed, short and real, and turned back to the spreadsheet. That night, after he dropped Mia with Clara for a rare overnight and was driving back alone, Logan sat with the strange accumulating weight of the past several weeks. He was not a man who processed things quickly. He moved through his interior life the way he moved through difficult physical work, methodically, without rushing, breaking it into sections that could be handled. The grief that had come when Sarah died had been a thing of extraordinary size, and he had not tried to rush it. He had simply stayed present to it until it shifted into something he could carry while still moving. He knew what he was feeling. He was a specific enough person about his own internal states to know. But knowing it and sitting with it were different from deciding what to do with it, and there were complications here that went beyond the personal. Ava Sterling occupied a world that operated on different physics. Her decisions happened at a scale that made his look like margin notes. The merger she was managing involved more money than the Delmore Center's entire projected 10-year budget, multiplied by a number that stopped meaning anything once you got above a certain threshold. He had a daughter, a building he didn't own yet, a grant process that could still fall through. He had a life that was real and present and fragile in the specific way of things that have been rebuilt from damage. He did not have space for carelessness. He drove and thought and let the night be what it was, and didn't try to close anything. The photographs came back in January. Not one photograph, a series published by a financial news outlet with a clear agenda showing Ava and Logan in 3 separate moments at the center. The parking structure 2 blocks over, and all, which bothered him most, through the window of the coffee shop on Greer where they'd stopped once after an evening session. The framing was suggestive without stating anything directly, which was the specific cruelty of that style of journalism. The headline read, "Distracted at the top, Sterling Meridian. CEO's unusual hobby raises questions among investors." Logan read the piece twice on his phone while standing in the center's supply room. He looked at the photographs. In all of them, Ava was either in conversation with him or looking at something he was pointing at, and in none of them did she look like a CEO generating positive PR. She looked like a person in a room. That was the thing about the photographs that was almost funny and not at all. They were looking for something that wasn't there, and the absence of it was the thing they decided to call suspicious. Ava called at 7 that morning. "I know," he said before she could say anything. "I wanted to tell you before you saw it. Too late. Logan, I'm not angry." He set the phone to speaker and kept his hands free. "I'm thinking." "What are you thinking?" "That they had someone on this building for at least 3 weeks, which means someone put them here." A pause. When she came back, her voice was fractionally different. Not colder, but more compressed, the way it got when she was running several parallel tracks simultaneously. "I know who it is." "Then you have a bigger problem than a newspaper story." "Yes," she said simply. And then, "I'm sorry you're in this." "I walked in on my own," he said, which was true, and he meant it, and she was quiet long enough that he thought she might have needed to hear that. What came next, in the weeks that followed the second round of photographs, was more complex than outright opposition. It was the particular political weather of people with power applying pressure without ever stating its source. Logan could feel it in the way Serena Chen's emails began arriving with slightly longer turnaround times, in the way a contact at the city planning office who had been responsive suddenly became unavailable, in a phone call from an attorney he'd never spoken to before who was very politely inquiring about the legal structure of the community center and whether it had considered incorporating under a different provision. He tracked each thing. He wrote it down. He didn't tell Ava about most of it, not because he was protecting her, but because he needed to understand the shape of it before he could talk about it usefully. He told Richie. Richie, who had a very specific and long history with exactly this kind of institutional obstruction, looked at Logan's notes and was quiet for a long time. "Someone's trying to make the center look unstable," Richie said finally. Yes. So that when the money doesn't come, there's a reason that isn't her. That's what it looks like. Richie sat back. Who knows about the grant timeline besides the people in this room? Logan looked at him. He'd had the same thought. Serena Chen, the city development office, and anyone who might have access to communications from either of them. Richie nodded slowly. So what do you do? It wasn't quite a question. Logan thought for a moment and then said, the same thing I've been doing, except faster. He called Ava that evening, and for the first time he told her the full shape of what he'd been seeing. He went through it methodically, without editorializing, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to understand was characteristic of how she handled real information. She went still. All the professional composure fell away, and she just listened, with her whole attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How long have you been tracking this? She asked. 3 weeks. You didn't tell me. I needed to be sure before I brought it to you. Another pause. Logan, you should have told me. I know, he said, and then, I'm telling you now. There was something careful in the silence that followed. The silence of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are both aware of it, and neither of them is sure what to do with the territory. There's a board meeting in February, Ava said finally. Harmon Capital wants a progress report on the merger terms and an update on, among other things, my current allocation of focus. She said the last phrase in a way that made its absurdity visible. Some members will use it as an opportunity to say you're distracted. Yes. Are you? The pause was the longest yet. No, she said. I'm more focused than I've been in 3 years. I just happen to also be doing this. Something shifted in her voice, something that wasn't quite vulnerability, but was in the same neighborhood. I find it easier to think clearly when I'm in that building. That probably doesn't make sense. It makes sense, Logan said. And it did. He understood it in his body, the way certain environments gave your thoughts more room. The center did that for him too. Had from the beginning. He thought about what Richie had said, about Mia in the corner with her workbook, sliding it across the table without explanation, about the photos through the coffee shop window, about the particular loneliness of Ava's voice in the apartment she described without ever quite describing, through the texture of what she left out. He thought about Sarah and the specific grief of that, and the way grief teaches you things about what you can't afford to waste. The board meeting, he said. What would you need? A clear narrative, that this isn't a distraction, that it's leadership. It is leadership. I know that, you know that. 12 people in a boardroom who are managing their own interests and nervous about a merger don't know that. Logan was quiet for a moment. Then we show them. How? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew the shape it needed to take, and he knew that the answer existed, and he had learned over 4 years of building things from nothing that knowing the shape was where everything started. Give me until Friday, he said. She said okay, and the way she said it, simply, without hedge or condition, with the total absence of the managed professional distance she used like protective glass between herself and most of the world, told him something she hadn't quite said in words. He held that for a moment after he hung up. Just held it. Then he got up, checked that Mia's light was out, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing. The legal pad had 12 pages by Friday morning. Logan had spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Mia went to sleep, working through what a real defense looked like. Not a PR strategy, not talking points, but an actual documented case. Attendance numbers from the Saturday workshops. Testimonials from 3 families who had given permission to be named. The grant timeline, now fully on track after the documentation corrections. Letters of support from the Neighborhood Resident Association and from 2 local businesses on Delmore who had noticed the change in foot traffic and said so in writing. A projected model, built with Priya's help, showing what the center could accomplish in its first operational year if the building contract was secured. It was not a polished presentation. It was evidence. That was the distinction Logan kept returning to as he worked. Polish could be manufactured, evidence had to be real, and real was the only thing that would hold up in a room full of people who were professionally skeptical of everything. He brought it to Ava on Friday afternoon at the center, sat across the table, and walked her through it without editorializing. She read each section with the focused stillness he'd come to recognize, the quality of attention that meant she was running her own analysis simultaneously, not just receiving information but doing something with it in real time. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is good," she said. "It's a start." "Logan, this is genuinely good." She set the last page down. "This is what leadership actually looks like, not the narrative, the substance behind it. The board needs to see it before the February meeting." "Some of them do," she said, and there was a particular precision in how she said some that told him she'd already been doing her own counting. The ones who could be moved, the ones who were immovable, the ones who were waiting to see which direction the weight shifted before committing to a side. She'd been running this calculation for longer than he'd known about the board pressure. He understood now that she was always running it, that it was the permanent background process of her professional life. "Who do you trust in that room?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "Margaret Osei. She's been on the board since before my father. She doesn't like noise, but she responds to substance." A pause. "Possibly Derek Tan. He's transactional, but he has a long memory, and he remembers that I was right about the Belcor acquisition when everyone else said no." "And the ones against you?" "Victor Hale has been positioning against me for 18 months. He has a relationship with two of Harmon Capital's senior partners that predates the merger discussion, which creates a conflict of interest he has never disclosed." She said it flatly. "And where Hale goes, Marcus Webb follows, because Marcus Webb has never had an original thought and doesn't intend to start." Logan looked at her. "You've known about Hale's conflict of interest." "Yes. And you haven't moved on it." "Not yet." Her voice was careful. "I needed it to be unambiguous before I used it. You move on something like that too early and you look defensive. You move on it at the right moment and you look like someone who was paying attention all along." He understood the strategy. He also understood something else, that Ava had been carrying this specific weight for months, knowing about a man who was working against her from inside her own boardroom, and had said nothing to anyone and continued showing up and doing the work. That required a particular kind of discipline that he recognized because he'd needed his own version of it, the discipline of not letting anger make your decisions. "The February meeting," he said, "I want to attend." She looked at him. "Logan? Hear me out." He leaned forward slightly. "Right now, the narrative they're building is that you're distracted by a community project run by someone they don't know. You make it known that I'm prepared to present the program's current state and projected outcomes in front of the board directly. It reframes the question. It's not a CEO with a distraction. It's a CEO who identified and developed a community investment that is already producing measurable results. It will also look like I'm using you to deflect scrutiny. Or it will look like you have enough confidence in what you built to put it in the room," he said. "Which one is true?" She held his look for a long moment. He didn't back off the question. "Both might be true," she said. "Okay," he said. "That's honest. What's the right call anyway?" She picked up the documentation again, tapped the edge of it against the table once. A small, restless gesture he'd noticed she made when she was working toward a decision, and the last pieces were falling in. Then she set it down. "I'll arrange it," she said. The call came from a number Logan didn't recognize on a Wednesday morning in the last week of January. He was at the center, going through supply inventory with Dom, and he stepped outside into the cold to take it. The voice on the other end was a man who introduced himself as a representative of Nexus Capital Group, a name Logan had never heard, and the man's tone was the particular brand of corporate warmth that is engineered to sound like friendliness and operates entirely as transaction. The man explained that Nexus had become aware of Logan's community initiative and was impressed by its scope and potential. He explained that Nexus was in a position to provide full funding for the building acquisition, a 3-year operating budget, and a national expansion framework. He explained that the total package under discussion would constitute enough financial security to fund Mia's education from now through graduate school and provide Logan himself with a salary that would be, as the man carefully phrased it, in keeping with the significance of the work he was doing. Logan stood outside in the cold and let the man finish. Then he said, "What's the condition?" A brief pause on the line, the pause of someone recalibrating slightly because the expected gratitude hadn't arrived. "We do have one request," the man said. "Given Nexus's position in several markets that intersect with Sterling Meridian Group, we'd ask that you be willing to speak publicly about your experience working with the Delmore Center and," another small pause, "specifically about the nature of Ava Sterling's involvement." "Specifically," Logan said, "we believe the public deserves an accurate picture of whether Ms. Sterling's investment in your project represents genuine community commitment or a strategic positioning move ahead of a major corporate merger." The cold was in Logan's chest now, and it wasn't the weather. "You want me to say she used the center for publicity," he said. "We'd simply ask that you share your honest perspective. I know what you'd ask." He looked at the building in front of him. The painted facade, the new door hardware, the windows that finally sealed properly against the cold. "Who is Nexus Capital Group?" "We're a private investment. Who's funding you?" The pause this time was longer. "I'm not in a position to discuss our investor structure at this stage of the conversation." "Then we're at the end of the conversation," Logan said. He hung up and stood there for a moment. His hands were very still, the way they got when something in him had gone past anger into a colder and more focused territory. He looked at the building for a long time. He thought about Mia's tuition, which was manageable now, and would stop being manageable in approximately 3 years when the private middle school he'd been hoping for became relevant. He thought about the building contract, still unsigned, still sitting on the edge of the financial gap that the city grant alone wouldn't bridge. He thought about the 3-year operating budget the man had described, and what that would mean for the families who used the Saturday workshops, and the families who didn't exist yet but would. He thought about all of it with the specific cruelty of someone who understood what was being offered and what it would cost. Then he went back inside and told Dom he needed an hour, and sat at the folding table in the empty main room and made himself work through it. He didn't call Ava, not yet. He needed to understand his own position first. Ava found out 3 days later. Not from Logan, from Nadia, who had been pulling on a thread in Nexus Capital Group's public filing history and had arrived at a structure that eventually traced back to a holding company with board members that included 2 names, Victor Hale and a private equity partner with documented ties to Harmon Capital's secondary investment arm. Nadia brought it to Ava at 7 in the morning, before the official workday, the way Nadia always brought the things that required privacy. She set the documents on Ava's desk, explained the chain of connections in her precise and uninflected way, and then said, "There's more," and explained that a source at a financial news outlet had confirmed Nexus had made the approach to Logan approximately 4 days prior. Ava's first reaction, which she did not show, was cold, not anger, something underneath anger. The foundational temperature of learning that someone in your building had spent months engineering a trap and had found the specific pressure point that would hurt most. She had prepared herself professionally for Hale's opposition. She had not prepared herself for the fact that he would use Logan to get there. Her second reaction was fear, which she also did not show. "Set up a call," she told Nadia. "With Logan?" "Yes." She waited until Nadia was out of the office before she allowed herself 30 seconds of sitting very still with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on the middle distance. She ran through the variables with the discipline she'd spent her professional life building. The board meeting was in 11 days. Hale had laid a trap that worked regardless of which way Logan moved. If he took the money, the story became community figure exposes CEO's manipulation, and the merger narrative collapsed. If he refused and Hale found another way to surface it, the existence of the offer itself became the story. And if Ava moved on Hale preemptively, she needed something airtight, because a CEO going after a board member 11 days before a major merger vote looked like exactly what Hale would say it was. She thought about Logan standing somewhere in that building, having made the decision he'd clearly already made, carrying it without telling her. She thought about the man who had refused her money the first time she'd offered it because he didn't trust her reasons. She thought about what it meant that he'd refused Nexus's money, which was a much harder refusal. She called him. He answered immediately. "You know," he said, "it wasn't a question. Yes. A beat. I was going to tell you today. I know that too. She paused. Are you all right? The question came out differently than she'd intended, softer, less professional, which was the honest version and also the more exposed one. She didn't take it back. I'm okay, Logan said. And then, after a moment, it was a real offer, Ava. The money was real. I know. I want you to know I didn't think about it for long. His voice was matter of fact. But I thought about it. I want to be honest about that. The fact that he told her that, the specific unmanaged honesty of it, landed somewhere behind her sternum in a way she had to keep her professional face over. Of course you thought about it, she said. It was designed to be hard to refuse. It was Mia's future, functionally. A short pause. But it also would have been a lie. And I don't have enough room in my life for things that aren't true. Ava was quiet for a moment. Outside her office windows, the city was doing its morning arrangement, traffic building on the avenue below, the sky the particular flat white of a winter without strong sun. Victor Hale is behind Nexus, she said. She could hear him absorb that. How connected is he to the approach? Close enough that if I can get the documentation in front of the right people in the right order before February 4th, he loses his seat on the board and possibly faces an SEC inquiry over the undisclosed conflict of interest. She kept her voice level. But I have to move on it before the meeting, not during it. If I surface it in the meeting, it looks like defense. If I surface it before, it looks like what it is. Which is? A CEO who has been paying attention, she said. Exactly the phrase she'd used with Logan weeks ago, and he'd remember that, and she intended him to. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you in that boardroom on the 4th. She paused. Not as a prop, Logan, as yourself, presenting the work exactly as it exists without managing it for the audience. And I need you to tell the room about the Nexus offer. The silence that followed was not reluctance. It was the specific quiet of someone taking the measure of what they're being asked and deciding whether they're prepared to carry it. You want me to walk into a room full of corporate executives and tell them I was offered money to publicly destroy you, and I turned it down, he said. Yes. And you think that helps you? I think it's true, she said, and I think true is the only thing that holds up. He'd said that to her once, or a version of it, and she'd thought about it since. She heard him recognize it now, the slight shift in his breathing, the almost imperceptible pause. All right, he said. The 10 days between that phone call and the board meeting were the most concentrated professional pressure Ava had navigated in 3 years. She moved through the Hale documentation with Nadia and her general counsel, building the case with the same methodical precision she applied to every complex problem, not rushing, not second-guessing the earlier steps, just moving through it in the correct sequence. The conflict of interest disclosure was the centerpiece. Hale's relationship with Harman Capital's secondary investment arm was not a minor technical violation. It was a fundamental breach of fiduciary responsibility that had existed for the entirety of the merger negotiation period, which meant every board vote in which he'd participated over that period was potentially compromised. She briefed Margaret Osei on a Tuesday evening, privately, in Margaret's home office, which was the correct location for this conversation, not Sterling Meridian's offices, not a neutral conference room, but the private environment that signals this is not business as usual. Margaret listened with the stillness of someone who has been in boardrooms for 40 years and has learned to be very quiet when the information is significant. When Ava finished, Margaret looked at the documents for a long moment. How long have you had this? Margaret asked. I've had the Nexus to Hale connection confirmed for 8 days. Before that? Suspicions, Ava said. For roughly 6 months. Margaret looked at her. You waited. I waited until I was sure. A long pause. Victor is going to call this a setup. He can call it whatever he wants. The filing dates are what they are. Margaret looked at the documents again. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite approval, but was adjacent to it. The look of a woman who respects a specific quality of patience. Derek Tan, she said, not quite a question. I'm meeting with him Thursday morning. Good. Margaret gathered the documents and stacked them neatly. And the young man, Logan Hayes. He'll be at the meeting. I've read the program documentation you sent. Another pause. It's solid work. It is, Ava said. None of it is mine. I provided some resources. The work is his. Margaret looked at her, and the look went on long enough to be something more than professional assessment. I see, she said, in a way that meant she saw considerably more than the program documentation. Ava said nothing to that and kept her face exactly as it was. On the morning of the 4th, Logan arrived at Sterling Meridian's offices 23 minutes early. He was wearing the same dark jacket he wore to every formal occasion, which Ava recognized and said nothing about. He looked the way he always looked, like himself, which she had come to understand was not a small thing. A lot of people became different people in high-pressure institutional environments, became louder or smaller, adopted postures. Logan stood in the lobby of one of the city's most prominent corporate towers and looked like a man who had walked into many rooms that were not designed for him and had long since stopped adjusting himself to fit them. Nadia met him and brought him to the pre-meeting waiting area. Ava came to find him 20 minutes before the room opened. He looked at her. She was in the charcoal blazer she wore to the meetings that mattered. He'd seen it in photographs, hadn't seen it in person before, and there was something in seeing it now that made the thing being asked of both of them concrete in a way the phone calls hadn't quite achieved. "How are you?" he asked. "I've done harder things than this," she said, and then, because it was him, "I'm nervous." He nodded. "Me too." "You don't look it. Neither do you." They looked at each other for a moment in the quiet of the waiting area, the particular quiet of two people who have spent months building something together and are now standing at the specific moment where all of it either holds or it doesn't. "Whatever happens in there," Logan said, "the work is real. The families are real. That doesn't change based on what 12 people decide." "I know," she said. "I just want to make sure you know that I know it too." He held her gaze, and she let him, which was its own kind of statement. She had spent 3 years not letting anyone see past the charcoal blazer. She was aware, in this moment, that she was not doing that, and she was aware that it didn't feel the way she'd always assumed it would feel. The boardroom doors opened. It was a long, glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor, and the 12 people already seated represented a combined professional weight that would have been crushing to most people walking in from outside it. Logan took the seat Ava had arranged for him at the side of the room, not at the table, but visible, present, unmistakable. Victor Hale was already seated. He looked at Logan when Logan walked in with the specific look of someone recalculating a situation they thought they'd controlled. His eyes moved to Ava, then back to Logan, and something in his face adjusted. Not panic, he was too experienced for that, but a tightening around the jaw that Logan recognized as the expression of someone who has realized the room doesn't have the shape they expected. Gerald Marsh called the meeting to order. The agenda moved through its opening items with the particular rhythm of corporate procedure, and Ava navigated the first 40 minutes with the precise, unhurried competence that Logan had watched her apply to every significant situation. Not performing calm, actually being it, which is a different thing that very few people manage. The merger update came and went. The Q4 results came and went. And then Gerald introduced the agenda item that had been the real subject of the meeting since its scheduling. Review of CEO strategic focus and external commitments. Hale spoke first. His presentation was practiced and smooth, which was what made it what it was. The careful assembly of facts arranged in an order designed to produce a conclusion. The photographs presented as documentation. The timeline of Ava's involvement with the Delmore project presented as hours diverted from company focus. A projected model, which was the particular cruelty, using Logan's own instinct for documentation against the narrative, showing the potential reputational cost if community investment was perceived as merger distraction by Harmon Capital's leadership. When Hale finished, the room had the specific texture of a space where something important is being decided and everyone knows it. Margaret Osei said, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Hayes." Hale's head turned fractionally. "That's irregular." "I'm aware of that," Margaret said pleasantly. Logan stood. He didn't use notes. He looked around the room, not performing confidence, just present, and he began talking about the work. Not about Ava, not about Sterling Meridian, not about the merger. About the families, about what the Saturday morning workshops produced, about the specific documentable change in a single block of a city neighborhood when people who were struggling found out that their struggle wasn't invisible. He was specific. He was concrete. He was exactly himself. And then he said, 11 days ago, I received an offer from a group called Nexus Capital Group. The room shifted. Logan laid it out with the same flatness he'd used describing everything else. The call, the terms, the condition attached. He watched Hale's face across the room as he spoke, and Hale's face was doing something complicated and ultimately unsuccessful. Logan finished and looked directly at Hale and said, I turned it down, because what they were asking me to say wasn't true. And I have a daughter who's watching me. I can't explain to her why I lied for money. I don't have a version of that explanation that works. The room was completely silent. Ava spoke into that silence. She spoke for less than 10 minutes. She laid out the Nexus to Hale connection with the particular efficiency of someone who has given this briefing once already to the people in the room who needed to hear it first, and who is now simply completing the record for everyone else. She placed the documents in front of each board member, Margaret, Derek, and the 6 others who were not in Hale's orbit, and she named the specific regulatory question raised by Hale's undisclosed conflict of interest across 18 months of merger-adjacent board votes. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. Victor Hale said, "This is a transparent attempt to deflect." "The filing dates speak for themselves, Victor," Derek Ton said from the other side of the table without looking up from the documents. The room stayed quiet. Hale looked at Logan. Logan looked back. There was nothing more to be said between them, and both of them understood that. Margaret Osei spoke into the silence with the precision of someone who has chaired many significant moments and understands that what gets said in the first 10 seconds after the room changes is what gets remembered. "I suggest we take a 15-minute recess," she said, "and then reconvene to discuss the appropriate path forward." She looked at Ava as she said it, and Ava held her gaze, and the look between them contained something that was not quite approval and not quite relief, but was in the territory of both. The specific recognition that passes between people who have both, in their separate ways, been waiting a long time for this particular room to finally see clearly. Logan sat back down in his chair at the side of the room. He looked at his hands for a moment. His daughter was at school right now, working through a math problem, or reading a book, or arguing about fractions with a patient quality she'd gotten from her mother. She had no idea he was here. He hadn't told her. Some things you don't prepare a 10-year-old for. You just go and do the thing and come home and make dinner and let the ordinary weight of an ordinary evening settle back over both of you like it always does. He looked up and found Ava watching him from across the room, and her face, for once, was not arranged into anything. It was just her face. The severe cheekbones and the dark hair and the eyes that were doing the exact opposite of holding him at a controlled distance. He held her gaze for a moment. Then the room began to move again. The 15-minute recess lasted 34 minutes. Logan sat in the waiting area outside the boardroom with a cup of coffee that Nadia had brought him without being asked, and he drank it slowly and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 34th floor. It was a clear February morning, cold and bright, the kind of winter day that looks warmer than it is from inside glass. He could see the Creston district from here if he knew where to look, which he did, the particular low skyline of the neighborhood against the larger grid of the city, the water tower on Sems, the gap where Delmore Street ran parallel to the elevated rail. He thought about ordinary things, whether Mia had remembered her library book, whether the heat at the center had cycled properly overnight. Dom had reported a problem with the thermostat 2 days ago, and they hadn't fully resolved it. Whether the building contract paperwork that Purcell's attorney had sent over on Monday needed a second read before Logan signed the section on maintenance liability. He thought about ordinary things because the extraordinary ones were happening behind a closed door 30 feet away, and he had done everything he could do, and the rest was not his to manage. Nadia appeared in the doorway. She looked at him with the particular professional composure of someone who has learned to deliver news without editorializing, and said, "They're ready for you." He stood, set the coffee cup on the side table, and went back in. The room had rearranged itself in a way that was not physical, but was immediately legible. Victor Hale was still at the table, but the quality of his presence had changed. He occupied his chair differently, with the careful stillness of someone who has been told to wait, rather than the controlled authority he'd walked in with 2 hours earlier. Marcus Webb, beside him, was looking at the table in the way of a man who has recently understood that he attached himself to the wrong side of something. Derek Tan had moved his chair approximately 6 inches in a direction that put visible distance between himself and Hale's side of the table, which was a small gesture loaded with significance in the particular physics of boardroom politics. Margaret Osei was standing at the head of the table. She looked at Logan when he entered and gave him the slight composed nod of someone who is being careful not to show her hand before the formal statement. Ava was seated. She looked at Logan briefly as he took his seat at the side, and her face told him nothing and everything. The specific controlled surface she maintained when she was feeling something significant and had decided that this room did not get to see it. Margaret spoke. She addressed the room with the authority of 4 decades of institutional knowledge and the particular cadence of someone who has rehearsed nothing but has thought everything through. She confirmed that the conflict of interest documentation regarding Victor Hale's undisclosed relationship with Harmon Capital's secondary investment arm had been reviewed by her and 3 other board members during the recess. She stated that the documentation raised questions serious enough to require immediate referral to Sterling Meridian's compliance and legal counsel. She stated that pending that review, it was the judgment of herself, Derek Tan, and 4 other board members that Hale's participation in any further merger-related votes would be suspended. Hale said, "This is Victor." Margaret's voice did not rise. It simply stopped him. "You'll have the opportunity to respond through the appropriate process, not here." The room was very quiet. Hale looked at Ava. The look was not quite anger. It was the specific expression of a man who has made a long calculated play and watched it fail, and is in the process of deciding whether he still has a viable next move. Ava returned his gaze with complete stillness, and Logan could see from his position at the side of the room exactly what Hale was seeing, a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 6 months and had not wasted a single day of that waiting, and who was not remotely interested in performing graciousness about it. Hale gathered his documents, stood, and left the room without a further word. Webb followed, which was the most autonomous decision Marcus Webb had made in months. The temperature in the room changed after the door closed behind them. Some fundamental pressure that had been present since the meeting opened finally lifted, and what was left was 12 people and a great deal of unfinished business. Margaret sat down and looked at Ava. "Continue." Ava continued. What followed was 2 hours of the most precise corporate work Logan had ever witnessed at close range, and he'd seen enough variation of it from the outside to have a baseline. Ava moved through the remaining merger agenda with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this meeting twice. Once for the version that went normally, and once for the version that had just happened, and was now running the second version with the particular clarity that comes from having removed the central obstruction. She addressed Harmon Capital's concerns about the merger timeline directly, with documentation that preempted 3 of the questions Logan could see board members preparing to ask. She presented the community program not as an addendum or a defense, but as a line item in her leadership strategy. Here is what I identified. Here is what it produced. Here is how it reflects the type of institutional judgment you are asking me to exercise at the scale of this merger. She was not warm in that room. She was not trying to be liked. She was trying to be believed, which is different, and she did it with the specific authority of someone who has earned the ground they're standing on and knows exactly how they earned it. Logan watched her and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in a boardroom: pride. Not possession, not protectiveness, just the clean, uncomplicated recognition of watching someone be fully and completely themselves in the most demanding environment they inhabit. He'd felt that before only once, watching Sarah in the hospital in the last months, choosing presence and humor over self-pity with a stubbornness that was entirely hers. He'd never expected to feel it again, and he hadn't gone looking for it, which is probably why it had arrived in a boardroom on a Tuesday morning in February, quiet and irrefutable. The meeting ended at 12:47. Board members filed out in the particular configurations of people who have things to process privately. Derek Tan stopped to speak briefly to Ava on his way out. Logan couldn't hear what he said, but he saw Ava nod, and the nod had the quality of something received rather than performed. Margaret Osei was the last to leave, and she paused at the door and looked at Logan. "The documentation you compiled," she said. "For the program?" "Yes." "Send me the full version." She looked at him for a moment in the direct way of someone who is deciding what to say. "I sit on the board of the Osei Family Foundation. We fund community infrastructure in 6 states. We've been looking for a program model worth replicating." She paused. "Your model is worth replicating." Logan looked at her. He said carefully, "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Send the documentation." She glanced briefly at Ava, something passing between them that had the texture of a long, complicated respect, and then she left. The room was empty except for Logan and Ava and Nadia, who was already gathering materials at the far end of the table with the specific purposeful efficiency that was her constant register. Ava stood at the head of the table, looking at the city through the glass wall, and Logan walked over and stood beside her. They were both quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I need to sit down," she said, "and eat something. I haven't eaten since yesterday evening." "That's a problem." "I know." She turned from the window and looked at him, and her face was doing the thing it had started doing only in the last month or so, showing him what was actually happening without filtering it first. The exhaustion was there, and the residual tension of the morning, and underneath both of those, something that looked like relief so deep it had rendered her slightly unsteady. "I know it's a problem. I forget to eat when I'm focused." "That's not a professional habit, Ava. That's just bad maintenance." She laughed, short and unexpected, the laugh of someone who has been locked inside high tension for hours and has just been handed something entirely ordinary and found that it helps. "Bad maintenance," she said. "Come on," he said. "There's a diner on Whitmore that does a reasonable turkey melt. Don't say you're too busy." "I have 4 calls this afternoon." "After the calls." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her running the calculation the way she ran all calculations, rapidly, thoroughly, and arriving at the answer before most people finished the question. But what he saw in her eyes when she landed on the answer was not the professional assessment. It was something quieter and older and significantly more real. "After the calls," she said, "the investigation into Victor Hale and the broader internal review that followed moved with the particular velocity of institutional processes that have been waiting for exactly this kind of authorization to begin. Sterling Meridian's compliance team and outside legal counsel spent the first 2 weeks of February building a complete documentation of Hale's conflict of interest over the merger period, and what they found as they went deeper was not contained to Hale alone. Marcus Webb had received communications from Harmon Capital's secondary arm through a personal email account that suggested he'd been providing internal information about Sterling Meridian's merger negotiating position in exchange for assurances about his own board seat in the post-merger structure. Ava sat across from her general counsel, a precise woman named Helen Park, on a Thursday afternoon and worked through the full picture. Helen laid it out with the clinical accuracy of someone who has learned not to editorialize about bad news and let the facts carry their own weight. "So we have Hale operating with an undisclosed conflict across 18 months of board decisions," Ava said, working through it, "and Webb providing internal negotiating information to Harmon's secondary partners." "That's the shape of it," Helen said. "The Webb piece has potential criminal exposure depending on what exactly passed and how Harmon's people used it. Has Harmon's main leadership team been made aware?" "Not yet." "That's your call." Ava thought about it. The instinctive move was to contain it, to manage the exposure carefully, to protect the merger from the toxicity of what 2 of her own board members had done. But she thought about Logan at the folding table on Delmore Street, working through documentation at midnight, and she thought about him in that boardroom telling 12 people about Mia and why he couldn't explain a lie to his daughter. And she thought about the specific quality of his voice when he'd said, "I don't have enough room in my life for things that aren't true." She did not want to manage this. She wanted it clean. "I'm calling James Harmon directly," she said. "Today." Helen looked at her. "That's a significant risk to the merger timeline." "I know." Ava picked up the documents. "But if the merger closes on top of concealed information that Harmon's own secondary arm was involved in, There are two possible futures, one where it comes out later and destroys everything we built, and one where it never comes out and we build the whole thing on a foundation that has a crack running through it. She set the documents down. Neither of those is acceptable to me. Helen was quiet for a moment. Some executives would find those odds manageable. I know, Ava said again. Call Harmon's office and tell them I need 30 minutes this afternoon. The call with James Harmon lasted 57 minutes. Logan found out about it that evening, not from Ava, but from a brief item in a financial news feed. Sterling Meridian CEO contacts Harmon Capital directly over internal governance concerns ahead of merger completion. And he sat at the kitchen table with Mia doing homework across from him and read it twice with the specific feeling of watching someone do the hardest version of a thing when an easier version was available. He texted her. I saw the Harmon news. She replied 8 minutes later, which in Ava's response timeline meant she was in between calls. It needed to be done. He typed back, I know, that's why I'm texting. A pause. Then, the turkey melt was good, by the way. He smiled at his phone. Mia, without looking up from her homework, said, Who are you smiling at? Nobody. Nobody, she repeated in the voice of someone who has heard this before and assigns it its correct value. He put his phone down and looked at his daughter. She was bent over a worksheet, pencil moving, gap-toothed, and entirely focused, dark eyes running down the page. She looked so much like Sarah in this light that it did the thing it sometimes still did. Not sharp anymore, not the way it had been in the first 2 years, but present, a quiet weight. He thought about Mia sliding her workbook across the table at Ava without explanation. He thought about the sneakers purchased specifically and worn in the wrong weather. He thought about all the small, unceremonious ways that people decide to let someone into their actual life, as opposed to the managed version of it. Dad? Mia said, still looking at her worksheet. Yeah. Is Ava going to come to the center on Saturday? I don't know. Why? I have a question about the fractions unit. She explained it better than my teacher. Logan looked at his daughter. You know I can help with fractions. Mia looked up at him with the expression that meant she was choosing her next words. You explain it the way you understand it, she said. She explains it the way I don't understand it yet. He wasn't quite sure what to do with the pride and the mild offense of that simultaneously, so he said, I'll ask her. Mia returned to her worksheet. Okay, she said, with the satisfaction of someone who has achieved the outcome they were working toward and sees no reason to make more of it than that. The Harmon call produced exactly what Ava had predicted it would, a short-term complication and a long-term clarity. James Harmon was 68 years old and had built his company on the specific philosophy that bad information costs more than bad news, and he responded to Ava's disclosure with controlled anger directed entirely at the correct people. Within a week, Harmon Capital's secondary investment arm had launched its own internal review of the web communications, and 2 of the secondary arm's partners were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The merger timeline shifted by 3 weeks. Financial press treated this as a setback. People who understood what had actually happened treated it as something else. Margaret Osei called Ava on a Friday morning, not in her official capacity, just on her personal cell. The board met informally last night, Margaret said. Derek Tan would like to put forward a motion at the March meeting formally commending your handling of the governance situation. That's not necessary, Ava said. I know it's not necessary. Derek wants to do it anyway. He's been in finance for 35 years, and he says he's never seen a CEO voluntarily expose a risk that could have been quietly buried. A pause. He said it as a compliment. I thought you should know. Ava was quiet for a moment. She was standing at the window of her office, which she did when she needed to think, and the city below was doing its mid-morning business in the particular way of cities on clear winter days, purposeful and indifferent and vast. Margaret, she said, the foundation I want to build, for single-parent families. I want to do it properly, not as a corporate CSR arm, as a standalone entity with real funding and a national scope. I know, Margaret said. You've been planning it. I want Logan to lead it. A beat. Have you asked him? Not yet. Then ask him, Margaret said simply, and the simplicity of it carried everything that needed to be said. That the asking was the part that required courage, and that everything else, the structure and the funding and the logistics, was the easy part. Ava asked him on a Saturday. Not at the center, not in a professional setting, not over the phone. She asked him in the diner on Whitmore, which had become the place where they had the conversations that didn't fit anywhere else. They'd been there 3 times now, and the booth in the back corner had started to feel like theirs, which was a domestic observation that Logan hadn't made out loud and was aware he was making. Ava laid it out the way she laid everything out, clearly, completely, without managing his reaction in advance. The scope, the funding structure, what she envisioned in terms of program reach, what it would mean for Delmore, which would become the flagship location rather than the only one, what it would mean for him in terms of both commitment and resources. She finished, and he was quiet for a moment. "You'd be the director," she said. "Not a consultant, not a figurehead, the actual person running it." "I know what director means." I wanted to be explicit. He looked at her across the table. She had her coffee cup in both hands, the way she did when she wasn't performing composure. And there was a coffee stain on her sleeve from earlier that she hadn't noticed. And her hair was slightly less arranged than it was in the boardroom. And she looked like a person who was asking him something that mattered to her in a way that went beyond the professional architecture of the proposal. "This is what you've been working toward," he said. Not a question. "It's what I started thinking about when I read a newsletter article about a man cleaning a building on Delmore Street," she said. "Yes?" "Why me?" "Because you already built it once with nothing," she said. "And because you understand what these families need from the inside, not from a research brief. And because—" She paused. "Because I trust your judgment more than anyone else's in this area, more than anyone I have on staff." Logan looked at his coffee for a moment. He thought about the building contract that Purcell's attorney had finally finalized 2 weeks ago. He'd signed it on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table while Mia watched, and then immediately asked if they could celebrate with pizza, and they had. He thought about what expansion would mean for Dom and Priya and Richie, whose investment in this thing was real and deserved to be honored in the growth of it. He thought about the 3 families from the Saturday workshop who had connected with each other and were now sharing childcare and school pickup rotations, which was the specific kind of practical solidarity that changed daily life in ways no grant metric would capture. He thought about what his wife would have said. Sarah had been direct about most things and impatient with false modesty, and she would have looked at him across this diner booth and said, "You know the answer already. Stop making it complicated in the particular fond and exasperated way she'd had." He looked up at Ava. "I need to talk to my team first," he said. "Dom, Priya, Richie, this affects them." "Of course. And I need the foundation's governance structure to have genuine independence from Sterling Meridian. Not on paper, actually." "That's already built into the proposal," she said. "I had Helen Park structure it specifically that way. You'd report to an independent board, not to me." He held her gaze. "And what do we do about the fact that you and I are—" He stopped. Restarted. "What do we do about the fact that this is complicated?" She was very still for a moment. The coffee cup was still in both hands. She looked at him with the particular quality of attention she had, the kind that meant she was not managing the conversation, but actually inside it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I stopped believing that complicated was a reason not to do something approximately 3 months ago." A pause. "Around the time someone told me they didn't have room in their life for things that weren't true." Logan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Talk to your independent board about the governance timeline. I'll talk to my team this week." "Is that a yes?" "It's a very specific not yet," he said, "which in my vocabulary is different." She understood. He could see it in the small, genuine shift at the corner of her mouth, not the professional composure, something underneath it, something that was just hers. The investigation concluded in the 3rd week of February. Victor Hale resigned from the Sterling Meridian board, citing personal reasons in a statement that was 3 sentences long and fooled nobody. Marcus Webb followed 4 days later after Sterling Meridian's compliance team provided the Webb-Harmon communication documentation to the appropriate regulatory body. Two of Harman Capital's secondary arm partners were formally placed on investigative leave, and the secondary arm's role in the merger was restructured with new oversight provisions that James Harman implemented with the specific anger of a man who does not tolerate being made complicit in things he didn't authorize. The financial press covered all of it, and what emerged in the coverage was not the story of a distracted CEO or a merger in trouble. What emerged was a different story entirely. A CEO who had identified internal corruption at significant personal risk to the deal she'd spent 2 years building, had refused to bury it, and had navigated the result with a precision that the more thoughtful analysts described in terms that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with character. The word that appeared most consistently in the coverage and in the conversations people had about the coverage was leadership. Not management, not execution, not any of the sterile vocabulary of corporate performance. Leadership, with its implication of something human at the center of the institutional machinery. Ava read a piece in a financial journal that used the word 4 times in 3 paragraphs and sat with it for a long moment. She thought about being 27 and walking into her father's company with a mandate she hadn't asked for and an absence of support she hadn't anticipated. She thought about 3 years of working inside a structure where some of the people around her were waiting for her to fail, and she had known it and kept going anyway. Not because she was fearless, but because stopping had never been an option she considered real. She thought about a man standing in front of a camera on a hotel staircase in the rain, using a $30 windbreaker to solve a problem with the most direct tool available to him, and leaving without asking for anything. She closed the article and called her assistant. "Nadia," she said, "clear my Thursday afternoon." "All of it?" "All of it." She looked out at the city. "And find out what time Mia Hayes gets out of school on Thursday." Nadia paused for exactly 1 second, the pause of someone processing an instruction in a new category, and then said, "I'll find out." Logan found out about the Thursday plan secondhand from Mia, who called him at 2:15 from the school office to say that Ava was in the parking lot and they were going to the bookstore and then for ice cream, and was that okay? Logan stood in the center on Delmore with the phone pressed to his ear and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Did she clear it with your school?" he asked. "She called the office this morning. Ms. Rowan said it was fine." "And you're okay with it?" There was a pause on Mia's end, the pause of a 10-year-old deciding how much to reveal. "She asked me first," Mia said, which was not quite an answer and was completely an answer. "Okay," Logan said. "Be home by 6. "We know," Mia said, and hung up. He stood in the empty main room of the center for a moment. The water-damaged wall was fully repaired and painted now. The baseboards were clean. The folding tables had been replaced by real tables, and the afternoon light through the windows did something honest to the space, showed it as it actually was. Not finished and not perfect, but real and standing and present, built out of the specific materials of people who had decided it mattered. He picked up his phone and sent Ava a text. She said you asked her first. The reply came back in 2 minutes. Of course I did. He looked at those 4 words for a long time, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely account for, he felt the particular loosening of something that had been held tight for years. Not grief, not quite, but the careful way you hold yourself after grief. The managed distance between what happened and what might still happen. The specific armor of someone who has learned that things end and has built his life accordingly. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked up the supply inventory Dom had left on the table. He went back to work. But the loosening stayed. Spring came to Delmore Street the way it came to most of the city's overlooked neighborhoods. Not with ceremony, but with the gradual, unglamorous fact of warmer air and longer evenings, and the particular smell of wet concrete drying in the sun after the last of the winter rain. Logan noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late March when he arrived at the center and found that someone had left a pot of yellow flowers on the front step. No note. He stood there looking at them for a moment, then picked them up and brought them inside and set them on the main table, and went about his morning. He found out later it had been a woman named Deb from the Thursday workshop, a mother of 2 who had arrived at the center 6 weeks earlier with the specific exhausted wariness of someone who has been let down by institutions enough times to approach every new one like a potential trap. She'd been coming weekly since January. The flowers were her version of saying something she didn't have language for yet, and Logan understood that and let it be what it was. The Hayes Sterling Community Foundation filed its incorporation documents in March and was formally established in the first week of April. The governance structure was exactly as Ava had promised: an independent board, a clear operational mandate, Logan as director with full authority over programming decisions and hiring. Sterling Meridian was the anchor funder, with secondary commitments from the OC Family Foundation. Margaret had moved with the decisive speed of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, and 3 additional institutional donors that Ava's team had cultivated over the winter. The name had been Logan's choice. Ava had offered to keep Sterling Meridian's name entirely out of it if he preferred. He'd thought about it for 2 days and then said, "No, put it in. You built this too." She'd been quiet on the phone for a moment. "Hayes Sterling," she'd said, testing the sound of it. "Unless you have a different preference." "No," she said, "I don't." Dom heard the name for the first time at the team meeting where Logan officially presented the foundation structure, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's going to confuse people." "Let them be confused," Richie said, which was the most succinct endorsement Dom was going to receive. Priya cried a little, which she managed with complete dignity by continuing to look at the presentation materials and pretending it wasn't happening, and nobody mentioned it. The Delmore Center did not transform overnight, which was the honest version of what happened and the version Logan insisted on telling when people asked. What it did was grow with the specific, organic messiness of things that grow from the bottom rather than being installed from the top. The Saturday workshops expanded to 3 mornings a week. Priya brought in a social work colleague who ran a family navigation program 2 afternoons a week. Not a hotline, not a form, just a person in a room available to help people understand which direction to walk through a system that was designed, not always maliciously but consistently, to be difficult to navigate alone. Dom took on a part-time operations role that he accepted with the reluctant grace of someone who had spent years being useful and was still slightly suspicious of being officially recognized for it. Richie, who had announced twice that he was stepping back to a consulting capacity, was present every single day and showed no signs of actual reduction. The families came, not in a flood, in the incremental, self-selecting way of people who find out about a place through someone else who went first and can report back. A single father named Marcus, who was managing a custody arrangement and a night shift job, and showed up at the Thursday workshop and spent the first hour not saying anything, and then asked a question so precise that Priya later told Logan it was the most efficiently stated summary of a legal problem she'd heard in 10 years of social work. A woman named Helen, not Logan's legal counsel, a different Helen, a kindergarten teacher with 3 kids and a recent divorce, who became the unofficial greeter for new arrivals because she remembered her own first visit well enough to know what those 20 minutes felt like. The building held. This was not a given, and Logan did not take it for granted. The maintenance costs were real, the heating system had its personality, the plumbing on the second floor required monitoring that had become Dom's particular area of expertise and grievance. But the structure was sound, and the lease was solid, and every Monday morning when Logan walked in and turned on the lights, he felt the specific satisfaction of something that had been built from nothing and was still standing. The merger between Sterling Meridian and Harmon Capital closed in late April, 3 weeks behind its original timeline and entirely intact. James Harmon made a statement at the closing that included an explicit acknowledgement of the governance issues that had been identified and addressed, which was notable for its unusualness. Corporate closings were not typically the venue for honest accounting of problems that had been solved, and which several financial observers read as a direct signal about the kind of operational culture the combined entity intended to maintain. Ava had not asked him to include it. He had included it anyway, which told her something about the man she was building with. The press coverage of the merger closing was different in texture from what it had been in January. The distracted CEO framing had evaporated entirely, not gradually, but with the specific abruptness of narratives that lose their oxygen when the evidence runs against them. What replaced it was a portrait that Ava found slightly uncomfortable in its warmth, but could not argue with in its accuracy. A CEO who had identified corruption inside her own organization, refused to manage it quietly, built something real while fighting to keep it, and closed the most significant deal in her company's history with the governance of the merged entity demonstrably cleaner than it had been before she intervened. She read a profile in a business magazine on a Sunday evening in her apartment, the same apartment whose Thursday night quiet had once been the specific texture of her loneliness, and felt the gap between who the article described and who she understood herself to be. Not because the article was wrong, but because the article could only see what was visible from the outside. It couldn't see the Saturday mornings on Delmore, with construction dust on her sneakers. It couldn't see Mia's workbook sliding across a table. It couldn't see the 14 conversations she'd had with Logan in the past 2 months that had nothing to do with the foundation and everything to do with the specific project of two people choosing to know each other. She set the magazine down and called him. He answered on the third ring, which meant he was doing something else and had made the decision to stop doing it. "You read the profile," he said. How did you know?" "You call me when you're processing something and don't know what to do with it." She held the phone for a moment. The apartment around her was different than it had been 6 months ago, not in its furniture or its layout, but in the way she inhabited it. There was a child's drawing on her refrigerator, made with extraordinary commitment to the color purple, depicting what Mia had described as the center, but the version that exists in my head. There was a coffee mug in her cabinet that lived at Ava's apartment because Mia had left it there on a Thursday afternoon, and neither of them had mentioned returning it. Small things. The specific gravity of small things. "The article says I'm a leader," Ava said. "You are." "I don't feel like one right now." "What do you feel like?" She thought about it. "Someone who made a lot of decisions this year that I couldn't fully see the outcome of when I made them. And they worked out. And I'm not entirely sure what to do with that because the next time I'll have to make decisions like that, there won't be any precedent for it working." Logan was quiet for a moment. "That's every time," he said. "That's just what it is. You make the call. You can't know. You live with it. You do that easily." "No," he said, and the directness of it was the thing she'd learned to trust most about him. The complete absence of performance in his self-description. "I do it without showing it. That's different." She heard him move, the specific sound of someone resettling in a chair, and then his voice came back a little closer, like he'd shifted the phone. "Mia asked me yesterday if you were going to come to her school's spring presentation next week." Ava went still. "She asked you." "She asked me to ask you," which is her version of asking directly while maintaining plausible deniability. "What is the presentation?" "Something about ecosystems. She worked on it for 3 weeks. It's on Thursday at 4. Ava looked at her calendar in her head, which she ran as a constant background process, and found the Thursday at 4, and found that it was clear, and felt the specific weightlessness of something she hadn't fully let herself want arriving with all its implications intact. "Tell her yes," Ava said. "Tell her yourself," Logan said. "She'll want to know you confirmed directly." There was a warmth in his voice when he said it that she had started to recognize. Not tenderness exactly, or not only that, but the specific warmth of a man who is watching something he cares about go in a direction that is right and is allowing himself to know it. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Not the foundation, not the professional partnership." He would know what she meant. "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't done it since Sarah." The name sat between them in the particular way it sometimes did, not painfully, not as an obstacle, but as a real thing that was part of the real person she was trying to know. She had asked him about Sarah exactly once, in the diner on Whitmore, over coffee, and he had talked about her for 15 minutes without being asked follow-up questions, which she understood was what he needed, the space to offer it without being interrogated. She had listened, and she had not performed comfort, and she had let him have the 15 minutes, and afterward he had looked at her across the table with something in his expression that she couldn't fully name, but had understood as a kind of gratitude for the absence of a particular kind of softness that would have required him to manage her reaction instead of his own. "I know," she said. "It's going to be imperfect," he said. "Things aren't going to work easily because we want them to. Mia has opinions about everything, and she's going to have opinions about this, and some of them are going to be complicated. I know. And I work weird hours, and I'm bad at answering my phone when I'm in the middle of something, And I forget to eat too, so we're both a maintenance problem." She laughed. The real one, the short, surprised one that arrived before she could arrange it. "That's your case for this?" "I'm not making a case," he said. "I'm just telling you what it is, so you know." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she thought about the hotel staircase in the rain, and a $30 windbreaker held up between her and the cameras, and a man who had said, "You okay?" heard her lie, and left without asking for anything. She thought about showing up at a building on Delmore Street on a Thursday afternoon and being told to sit in the corner and not speak unless spoken to, and how that had been the first time in 3 years she'd felt correctly placed. Not in charge, not managing, just present. She thought about 12 pages of documentation on a legal pad, and Richie's coffee thermos, and a child's workbook sliding across a table, and the specific sound of Logan's voice on the phone at 7 in the morning saying, "I know," in a way that meant I already knew, and I'm with you anyway. She thought about what it costs to trust someone when you have built your entire life on the architecture of not needing to. "I know what it is," she said. "I've been watching it." A beat. "Thursday at 4, he said. "Thursday at 4, she confirmed. The spring presentation was held in the school's gymnasium, which smelled the way school gymnasiums universally smell, and was decorated with the specific enthusiastic artlessness of a space organized by people who are 10 years old and have access to construction paper. Logan arrived first and saved a seat, and Ava arrived 4 minutes before the presentation started and sat down beside him, and neither of them said much because neither of them needed to. Mia's section was about the Chesapeake Bay watershed. She had made a diagram that was technically impressive and visually bold, and she presented it with the specific combination of seriousness and barely contained pride that belonged entirely to her. When she found them in the audience, she looked at them sitting next to each other for one long moment, the look of a 10-year-old who sees exactly what she's looking at and is deciding what to do with the information. And then she gave a very slight nod, like something had been confirmed that she'd suspected for a while, and turned back to her diagram and kept going. Logan felt Ava go still beside him at the nod. He didn't look at her. He looked at his daughter and kept his face exactly as it was. After the presentation, Mia found them in the gymnasium crowd with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they would be, and she told Ava that her diagram had been the most accurate in the class, and she had received an A- because Mrs. Patterson had an issue with the color coding, which was wrong. Ava said the color coding looked clear to her and asked what Mrs. Patterson's specific objection had been. Mia explained it in technical detail. Ava said that was a subjective critique and not a methodological one, and Mia should feel good about the work regardless. Mia considered this and said fair, which was high praise in her vocabulary. Logan watched this exchange from approximately 18 inches away and felt the loosening from the kitchen table evening in February, the one he'd named and then set aside, arrive again, fuller this time, less tentative. The specific settling of something that has been making its way toward its correct position for a long time and has finally found it. He did not try to contain it. He just let it be there, in the gymnasium that smelled like school gymnasiums, with construction paper on the walls and his daughter arguing about color coding with the most precise woman he'd ever met. The Foundation's first major program launch happened in late May, a partnership with 6 school districts in the metropolitan area to provide single-parent families with coordinated access to after-school care, legal aid, and financial navigation services. The model was built directly on what the Delmore Center had produced, not theorized, not projected, but documented and tested and revised through 18 months of actual operation. Logan had presented the model at a statewide community development conference in April and received the specific response that tells you something has landed correctly. Not applause, but the silence of people sitting with the weight of something real. The launch event was held on a Thursday morning at the Delmore Center, which was full in a way it had never been. The families who had been part of the center from the beginning were there. Marcus, who had resolved his custody situation and had started volunteering at the Tuesday sessions. Deb, who had brought actual flowers this time. Several arrangements, placed with careful consideration around the room. Helen, who had organized the arrival of 11 families from the Thursday group with the efficiency of someone who has made logistics her superpower. Dom was there, wearing a collared shirt under protest, and Priya and Richie, who had a coffee thermos and was standing in the corner looking at the room with the expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time and sees no reason to announce it. Margaret Osei was there, which was not on the program and which Logan only discovered when she walked in through the front door 8 minutes before the event started. She looked at the room with the careful attention she brought to everything and then found Logan and said, "This is what it looks like when it works." He said, "We're not done yet." "That's also what it looks like when it works," she said. Ava spoke at the event briefly because Logan had asked her to and because it was right that she did. She was not the same person who had stood at a podium at the investor briefing 6 months prior. Or she was that person plus something else, something that the professional composure couldn't contain the way it once had. She talked about the foundation and what it intended to do and what it owed to the community that had made it real. She was precise and she was genuine. And when she talked about the Saturday workshops and what they produced, she did not speak from research or data. She spoke from presence, from having been in the room, which is a different thing entirely, and every person listening could feel the difference. She did not look at Logan while she spoke, but when she finished and stepped back from the small podium Dom had found at a church sale for $12, she looked at him, and the look was simple and complete. He nodded. She sat down. The formal part of the event finished at 11:30, and the room dissolved into the natural, undirected warmth of people talking to each other because they want to, rather than because the program tells them to. Logan moved through the space doing the thing he always did at the center, checking in, listening, connecting people who didn't know yet that they needed to know each other. He was in the middle of a conversation with Marcus and a woman named Patricia, who both had kids at Elm Street Elementary and didn't know it yet when he felt a small hand take his. He looked down. Mia was standing beside him. She had come with Clara for the event, and she had been circulating with the self-possessed ease of a child who was entirely at home in this room, talking to Priya and receiving snacks from Dom and spending a long, serious conversation with Richie that Logan had been curious about. But now she was holding his hand with the slightly intentional quality of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She looked up at him, then she looked across the room to where Ava was talking to Margaret Osei, and then back at him. "Are you happy, Dad?" The question arrived with the specific directness that belonged entirely to Mia. No preamble, no softening, just the thing she wanted to know, asked plainly. He thought of all the times in the past 4 years she'd asked him things like this, and he'd given her the answer that was true, but managed. The answer that protected her from his full interior weather while still being honest enough that she couldn't feel the omission. He looked at his daughter. He thought about what he owed her, and decided the honest answer was the truest form of the thing. "Yes," he said. "I am." She looked at him for a moment with the dark eyes that were entirely her mother's. Then she said, "Okay," and dropped his hand and went back toward the snack table, which was Dom's territory, and where the good things were. Logan stood there for a moment. Across the room, Ava's conversation with Margaret had ended, and she was standing alone for the first time that morning, holding her coffee and looking at the room. The real room, the folding tables and the patched wall and the hand-lettered workshop schedule and the flowers Deb had placed everywhere. She looked at it the way you look at something you were part of building and are still slightly surprised exists. She looked up and found him watching her. He crossed the room. "Mia asked me if I was happy," he said when he reached her. "What did you say?" "Yes." Ava held her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see the careful architecture of her composure doing what it always did when something real arrived. Not holding it out, but holding it carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. "I haven't been asked that in a long time," she said. "I'm asking now." She looked at him. The room was moving around them, full of noise and children and the particular warm chaos of a community that has found its footing. And she looked at him the way she'd looked at him the morning of the board meeting, in the waiting area on the 34th floor, with her face showing him what was actually happening. "Yes," she said. "I think so. I'm still figuring out what it feels like." "That's okay," he said. "Take your time." She shook her head slightly, the way she did when he'd said something that landed differently than she'd expected. "You're very patient." "I have a 10-year-old, he said. You develop patience or you don't survive. She almost smiled. The almost was its own complete thing. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to just hear it without managing it. Okay? I was lonely for a long time, she said. Not sad. Lonely is different. I had a full life. I had work I was good at and people who relied on me and outcomes I was proud of. And I was lonely in the specific way of someone who has never figured out how to let the work stop being the whole thing. She paused. I didn't know I was doing it until I walked into a building on Delmore Street and sat in a corner and didn't talk, and came back the following week and the week after that. Another pause. I want you to know that. Not because I need you to do anything with it, just because it's true, and I don't say true things about myself often enough. Logan was quiet for a moment, holding the weight of what she'd said with the care it deserved. I know, he said. I've known for a while. I figured. I was lonely too, he said. Different flavor. I had Mia, I had the work, I had people I trusted, but there's a version of yourself that you stop showing people after you've lost someone, because showing it means it can be taken again. He looked at the room for a moment, the room he'd built out of nothing, that was full of people, that was real. You're the first person I've shown it to since Sarah. Ava was very still. That's significant to me, he said. I wanted you to know. She nodded, just once, but the nod contained everything. The precision of a woman who has learned to say the most important things with the fewest possible words and has decided that this is one of those moments. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the coffee cup. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood there in the middle of the room, in the noise and the warmth of it, not making anything of the gesture except what it was. Two people who had each been navigating alone for a long time, choosing, quietly and without fanfare, to stop. The months that followed had the specific, unglamorous texture of real life. Not a highlight reel, but the accumulating weight of ordinary days that matter more than the extraordinary ones. The Foundation's first cohort of partner schools reported a measurable increase in family engagement metrics by the third month. Logan hired 2 additional program coordinators, both of them parents who had come through the center and understood the work from the inside. Dom found a contractor willing to fix the second-floor plumbing at a reasonable rate, which he announced at the team meeting with the quiet triumph of someone who has been carrying a logistical grievance for months and has finally resolved it. Mia started middle school in September and developed strong opinions about her teachers that she expressed at the dinner table with the precision of a future critic. She continued to have strong opinions about Ava, which were generally positive and occasionally delivered with the specific candor of a child who has decided someone is close enough to be spoken to honestly. She told Ava once, while they were doing homework at Logan's kitchen table, that she dressed better for the center than she used to, which Ava accepted as the compliment it was intended to be. Ava moved more of her work to the Foundation in the second half of the year, maintaining her CEO role at Sterling Meridian, but building a team structure that allowed her to be present at the center 2 days a week without managing the operational details that belonged to Logan. This was harder than it sounded. She was a person who had spent her professional life in control of outcomes, and learning to be present without controlling was its own sustained discipline. She was not always successful. There were conversations where Logan said, quietly and without judgment, "That's not your call." And she had to sit with the resistance of that and let it pass, which it did, with practice. She was not good at not being in charge. She was getting better. Logan was not good at asking for things he needed. He was getting better at that too. These were not solved problems. They were problems in progress, which is the only version of problems that actual people have. They were married on a Saturday in October, 14 months after the board meeting. Not a large wedding, a small room, the people who were real to them, a late afternoon that turned into an evening without anyone deciding it should. Dom was there, and Priya, who cried again and managed it with the same dignity as before. Richie was there with his wife of 38 years, a small woman named Gloria, who shook Logan's hand and said she'd heard a lot about him, and most of it was accurate. Margaret Osei came, which was not expected, and was entirely right. Clara was there, because Clara had held things together on the evenings when Logan was running late, and the world was too much, and her presence at the table was a form of acknowledgement for all of it. Mia was the one who decided where she stood during the ceremony, which was between them, which was where she believed the geometry of it required her to be, and neither Logan nor Ava had any argument with that. She wore a purple dress she had selected herself. Before the ceremony, while Logan was in the other room, and Ava was standing in the small, adjacent hallway, doing the thing she did when she needed to be still, hands flat against the wall, eyes in the middle distance, just breathing. Mia came and stood beside her. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mia said, "Are you nervous?" "A little," Ava said. "Are you?" Mia considered it. "No," she said. "I decided a long time ago." "When?" Mia thought about it with the seriousness she brought to actual questions. "When you came back the second Saturday," she said. "People who are only there for the reason they say they're there don't come back the second time." Ava looked at this 10-year-old girl who had her father's directness and her mother's eyes and an interior compass that had been calibrated somewhere deep and early and held its direction without effort. "When did you figure that out?" Ava asked. "I don't know," Mia said. "I just know things sometimes." She looked up at Ava. "You know things too. That's why you came back." Ava looked at her for a moment. The nerves were still there. She was not going to pretend otherwise, but underneath them something was very settled, the way the ground is settled. Not dramatic, just present and solid. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why." Mia took her hand, the way she had taken Logan's at the launch event, with the same intentional quality. They stood there until someone came to say it was time. The Delmore Center is still open. It opens every weekday morning at 8:30, and on Saturday mornings, it opens at 9. And there are usually people waiting before either of those times because that is the nature of need. It does not observe office hours. The workshops still run, expanded now, with more facilitators and a waiting list that Logan tracks and does not stop being bothered by because being bothered by it is the appropriate response to a list of people who need help and don't have it yet. The foundation has replicated the model in 11 cities. Not perfectly. Replication is never perfect. Every community has its own specific geography of need and its own specific local knowledge that cannot be templanted, and Logan knows this and builds it into the model, which is why the model works where a more centralized approach would have failed. Each site has its own version of Dom, someone who grew up in the neighborhood and understands it in their body, and its own version of Priya. And the foundation's job is to resource and connect, and then stay out of the way of the actual work. Margaret Osei's foundation has co-funded 4 of the 11 sites. She and Ava speak on the phone once a month, in a relationship that has evolved from board governance to something more genuinely mutual, the specific respect of 2 women who have both, in their own ways, learned to be clear-eyed about power and not mistake its possession for its purpose. The merger between Sterling Meridian and Harmon Capital has been, by most measurable accounts, a success. Ava does not use the word success comfortably because it implies finality, and she is constitutionally suspicious of finality. What she will say is that the combined company has a governance structure she believes in, a leadership team she trusts, and a culture that is not yet what she wants it to be, but is moving in the direction she has decided to take it. Progress is her preferred metric, progress and honesty about the distance still to go. Victor Hale's regulatory matter was resolved through a consent agreement that included a 5-year prohibition from serving on public company boards. He has not spoken to Ava or about her in any forum she is aware of, which she considers neither victory nor resolution, just the absence of an obstruction that was never personal to begin with. He had been trying to protect an interest. She had been trying to protect something different. Those were always going to conflict. Marcus Webb left finance entirely, and according to a brief item Logan found in a local business newsletter, has been working for a small nonprofit in a Midwestern city. Logan showed Ava the item on a Sunday morning over coffee, without comment, and she read it and handed it back and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "People can go in different directions." "Yes," Logan said. "I don't know if that story ends well or not." "Neither do I," he said. "That's his to figure out." She nodded and picked up her coffee, and that was the end of it. Mia is 11 now, in the 6th grade, still convinced that fractions are a conspiracy, deeply committed to her diagram about the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and currently lobbying for a dog with the specific strategic patience of a child who understands that direct requests are less effective than the gradual accumulation of evidence in her favor. She brings it up once every 2 weeks, with a new supporting argument each time. Logan and Ava have not said yes. They have also not said no, which Mia correctly identifies as a favorable position. On a Sunday afternoon in November, 1 year after the wedding, Logan and Ava are sitting at the kitchen table of the house they moved into in the summer. A real house, not large, with a backyard that Mia has strong opinions about, and a kitchen that required work, and a neighborhood that Logan chose because it was 6 minutes from Delmore Street. Mia is at Clara's for the afternoon, which means the house is quiet in the specific, slightly disorienting way of homes that are usually not quiet. Logan is going through foundation budget projections. Ava is reading a governance document that requires her full attention and is receiving approximately 80% of it, because 20% of her attention is on Logan, the way some portion of her attention always is now. Not surveillance, just presence. The specific awareness of someone who has learned to let proximity be what it is, rather than something to manage. Outside, the November light is doing the low amber thing it does in the late afternoon, coming through the kitchen windows at an angle that does something honest to the room. Shows it as it actually is. Imperfect and lived in and entirely real. Logan looks up from the projections. He looks at his wife, who is frowning slightly at her governance document, who has a pen behind her ear that she put there and forgot about, who is wearing a fleece pullover that belongs to him and has not returned it, who turned 32 in the summer and spent her birthday at the Delmore Center because there was a Saturday workshop and she didn't want to miss it. He thinks about a hotel staircase in the rain, about a folding chair in an empty room, about 12 pages on a legal pad and a little girl's workbook sliding across a table in a boardroom going silent, and a phone call at 7 in the morning and a hand turned over to hold his. He thinks about what it means to build something from nothing, and how the materials are never what you expected, and how the thing you build is never quite the thing you planned, and how that is the only way it can be real. He thinks about what his daughter asked him in the middle of a room full of people. "Are you happy, Dad?" He is, not in the simple, unqualified way of someone who has resolved all their problems. His problems are ongoing. The foundation's funding picture requires constant attention. The second-floor plumbing at Delmore is making new sounds that Dom is tracking with professional suspicion. Mia will be 12 next year, and he has been told by everyone who has survived that year that 12 is its own particular undertaking. He is happy in the complex, specific way of someone who has looked at what his life actually is. The real version, imperfect and incomplete and still going, and recognized it as the thing he would choose. Ava looks up from her document and finds him looking at her. "What?" she says. "Nothing," he says. She looks at him for a moment with the eyes that no longer hold him at any distance. "You're doing the thing where you look like you're thinking something significant and you're not going to say it." "I'm going to say it," he said. "I was just waiting until you were looking." She sets the document down. She looks at him. He says, "I think we built something real." She is quiet for a moment. Outside, the light shifts, the amber going gold, November doing what November does. Inside, the kitchen is warm and the projections are spread on the table, and the governance document has a pen behind it belonging to a woman who sometimes forgets where she puts things, who is imperfect and precise and still becoming who she's going to be, who came back the second Saturday and the Saturday after that, who held his hand in a room full of people without making anything of it except what it was. She reaches across the table and puts her hand over his. "Yes," she says. "We did." The most valuable investment isn't money. Every person who has ever built something from the ground up knows this. Even when the spreadsheets are running and the grant timelines are slipping and the second-floor plumbing is making sounds that can't be good. What you invest in a person, your time, your presence, your willingness to see them clearly rather than strategically, that is the thing that compounds. That is the thing that lasts beyond the quarterly returns and the board meetings and the press cycles that come and go. Logan Hayes knew this when he had nothing. It was the specific knowledge of people who have lost enough to understand what remains, what is essential, what actually holds. He carried it through 4 years of building a life out of what was left after grief, and he carried it into a building on Delmore Street, and he carried it into a boardroom on the 34th floor, and he carried it to a kitchen table on a November afternoon with the projections spread out and the amber light coming through the windows. Ava Sterling learned it later, and in a different way, and it cost her more because she had more to let go of before she could receive it. The things we build around ourselves to survive become the things we have to dismantle to live. That is the specific difficulty of the kind of strength she had, the kind that is made in isolation, that does not know how to be strong in the presence of someone else, that has to learn from the beginning what strength looks like when it is shared. She learned it in a building on Delmore Street, sitting in a corner on a folding chair, and then coming back again, until the building and the people in it were as much hers as anything she had built alone. There is no clean lesson in any of this. Life doesn't produce clean lessons. It produces specific, difficult, unglamorous, occasionally luminous experiences, and we make of them what we can. What Logan and Ava made was a foundation, literal and otherwise, built on the particular bedrock of people who decided to see each other honestly, which is rarer than money and harder to find, and the only material that holds when everything else gets tested. The flowers on the front step of the Delmore Center are there every Tuesday morning now. Different kinds, different colors, left by different people. Nobody organizes it. It just happens, which is what it means when something belongs to a community. It starts being maintained by the people inside it, not because they were asked, but because they understand that it's theirs. That's what you build when you build right. Not a building, not a company, not even a foundation. You build the kind of place where people leave flowers on the front step on Tuesday mornings. Because they want to. Because they found something there that was worth the gesture. Because they are no longer alone in it. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point.